Hello everybody, and welcome to what I was about to call sunny Wales. It was sunny up until about 20 seconds ago, and obviously as you can probably tell, it's not now. It was raining about 20 seconds before that as well, but that's stopped. That's why I came into these woods to seek shelter from the rain, but these woods have no longer got any leaves, so that would have been completely pointless. Anyway, this morning I'm on my way up this little meandering footpath behind you to the top of a hill from which you get amazing views of the surrounding mountains. Sometimes, I mean, the mountain weather forecast suggests that there's only a 20% chance of cloud-free summits today, so maybe not, we'll have to see. But today is the only day I can come out this week because I'm spending the rest of the week packing up the prints that you've bought in the print sale. And I reckon that's the second most fulfilling way to spend your time as a photographer, packing up prints that people have spent their hard-earned money on. The most fulfilling thing, obviously, is coming out to take photos, which is what I'm doing today, so quite a good week, really. Anyway, I also want to do a bit of a lens test, not a scientific one. Clearly, I've never done anything scientific in my life, but yeah, a lens test of a kind of lens that I hardly ever use, but I love at the same time. Let me explain. I took a risk, and needless to say, it didn't pay off. Feet are soaking. Right, folks, bit of an update. It's about 2 hours after I last spoke to you, and I'm still not exactly where I want to be. I've had an absolute nightmare with geography. Nearly there, but it's getting windy, as you might be able to hear, so this might be the shortest lens test you've ever seen. How'd you like the view? Non-existent in basically every direction. There's an amazing valley down there, you can't see it at all. Gonna have to go home to finish this thing.
I'd have had a more productive day if I'd watched grass growing, I think, which, given that it's November and grass doesn't really grow, gives you a sense of how much I feel I've achieved today. Yeah, so you might remember in the video last week, I said that I was going to go into the mountains and test this 85mm 1.8 lens that Lumix sent me as a loan lens last week. And yeah, that was today. Don't think I got one good photo. Nevertheless, I was very excited to try this lens because this 85mm is the first in our line of lenses, 1.8 lenses, that Lumix is bringing out. I think there's a 24, a 50, I think there's a 35 as well. And this, I reckon, is the one that I'm least interested in, but it's the first to come out, and given that in the press photo they all look like the same size, I wanted to try this out just on the S5 to see what it felt like, basically. By the way, just quickly, the S5, a lot of people have asked in the comments of the previous video why I've ended up with an S5, and some people have assumed that Lumix are paying me to use it. I wish that was the case, it's absolutely not. Basically what it is, when I last went to Iceland in January, I was running a workshop there with Nigel. Sunrise was at 10 AM, sunset was at 4 PM. And every time I've been on a trip like that, I've kind of thought to myself, I could probably do with a full frame camera in my lineup to benefit from all this low light stuff that I'm invariably doing in the winter. And so from January, or February it might have been, to July, I was plotting how I was going to work a full frame camera into my gear. I couldn't really settle on anything. I didn't like the idea of either the S1 or the S1R from Lumix. I thought they were too big and heavy, and basically by July I'd got to a point where I was about to pull the trigger on a Sony A7 III, I think, is that the latest one that's out, and a Sony A7R, whichever one the latest one is, for the high resolution stuff that I'd maybe not use all that much, to be honest, but I got quite excited about just having two cameras in the same system. That week, Lumix reached out to me and said, James, we've got a new camera, would you like to try it? It's a full frame camera, you might be interested in giving it a look. I tried the S5, loved it. And the reason that I wanted one is it means that I don't have to worry about different menu systems, because I want to keep using my Micro Four Thirds stuff for when I'm in bright conditions and when I want a slightly lighter setup. And now I can seamlessly switch to full frame with basically the same menus and stuff and the same body layout as my G9. So yeah, that's why I've ended up with the S5, and eventually when they come out, I'll probably end up with a 24mm and a 50mm from this range, but since they're not out yet, I wanted to try the 85. However, I thought it'd make an interesting video to look at this lens because I've taken lots of photos at this kind of focal length in my career so far. I love this focal length. I don't use it all the time, but over the years I've seen lots of questions about whether or not people should buy a lens like this if they take photos like I do, kind of outdoor, landscape, adventure type photography. Do you need what is essentially a portrait lens? Now on my Micro Four Thirds kit, I do have a dedicated lens for this kind of stuff, but I don't often use it primarily because I think it's a bit too big and heavy. It's this, the 42.5 f1.7, I think it is. As you can see, it's just massive. No, size and weight isn't the reason that I don't use this, but look at this compared to the lens that Lumix sent me by mistake, I think, when they meant to send me this one. This is the Sigma f1.4 85mm lens. Look at the difference in those two. And people still wonder why I went to Micro Four Thirds versus full frame. By the way, before you tap away in the comments, I know that there are differences between these two lenses, but this, regardless of how sharp it ever was, would never end up in my bag. This is heavier than any 24-70 lens I've ever used. And like I say, even if it was the sharpest thing ever, I wouldn't ever go anywhere near this. If you're a portrait photographer and you always use this focal length, I get it, but for me, no, not interested. Anyway, the reason that I've never used this lens, and I promise you, I could probably count on one hand the number of times I have used it. The reason, or there are a few of them, namely that pretty much every time I want to take a photo at this kind of focal length, I use my telephoto lens. Now this lens is obviously incredibly nice and light. It weighs hardly anything, to be honest, but given that I always take my telephoto absolutely everywhere with me because it's so versatile, it means that anytime I add a prime lens that's included in this focal range, it's going to be adding weight because it's in addition to this lens. And if you've watched my channel for a while or just listened to me in the last 3 minutes, you'll know that weight is a big deal to me. So that's the first reason I don't really like primes at this focal length. It's covered in my zoom. Thing is, there are benefits of primes other than weight. Typically, primes of a similar quality to a zoom lens is going to be a bit sharper. However, for the kind of things that I shoot, I think that really rarely matters, to be honest. Now, if you're, for instance, taking photos of people, I think that sharpness matters, critical sharpness matters. However, if you're taking photos of landscapes, of course it's important that your photos are still sharp, but the difference between a super tack sharp photo and just a nice sharp photo is much harder to spot, particularly if you're not looking at the images from different lenses side by side. And therefore, critical sharpness to me is not as important as it is to product photographers, or as I say, portrait photographers, people taking other kinds of photos. So yeah, sharpness is another advantage of primes that I don't really care for. And the other advantage is obviously low light performance. This lens at f1.7 is obviously much brighter than this lens, which is a 2.8. Now, at much wider focal lengths, I use primes quite a bit in low light. So for example, this 15mm, another Micro Four Thirds lens that I use quite a bit. The reason I use this a lot in low light is because the focal length, 30mm full frame equivalent, is such that I can get good handheld photos basically in the dark when I shoot wide open with it. But when you get to longer focal lengths like 42.5 or 85mm full frame equivalent, which 85mm on a full frame camera, when you get into these longer focal lengths, if you're shooting in the dark, then even when you're shooting wide open, let's say for argument's sake you end up with a shutter speed of 1/10 of a second, that's probably still not going to be quick enough for you to get a handheld photo. At which point, regrettably, for someone like me who despises using tripods, I'm better off using a tripod. And if I haven't got a subject that's moving lots in the frame, then my shutter speed doesn't really matter that much. I can have a longer shutter speed and get a bigger depth of field in the frame with a narrow aperture. Now, depth of field is the other advantage of primes, or sometimes it's an advantage. Other times, it's really not. So the beauty of a lens like this, and I do think that an 85mm prime is one of the most exciting lenses in photography because you can get such a razor thin depth of field, which for things like portraits is amazing. However, if you're shooting landscapes at f1.8 with a focal length of 85mm, you're going to have a razor thin depth of field, which for the most part, when you're in mountains and landscape environments, that's not what you want really. And that's not such an issue at the wider focal lengths, where depth of field is not such a big factor as it is at the longer focal lengths. So I use primes a lot in the dark. I think they're fantastic tools, but a long prime, a relatively long prime, such as an 85, is for someone like me, a much less useful tool than a wide prime. Basically, that's all the stuff that I wanted to talk about at the top of that hill. But I would have got very wet, and it was actually quite windy as well, so decided to do it here, since I've got a dedicated space for it now. Next time you see it, some pictures will be up, which will be quite nice, I think. Anyway, yeah, as I say, I'm very excited for the other lenses in this lineup, particularly the 24 and the 50. I think I'll be adding to my kit, and I'll do more videos on the lenses that I choose for the S5. So yeah, do stay tuned for more washed out videos that end up here. Also, a huge thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this week's video. So Skillshare is an amazing online learning platform with literally thousands of classes in all kinds of different topics, from illustration, creative writing, business, productivity, which I was telling you all about last month. I've been learning all about productivity and it's going very well. It's really helping. And you may remember a few months back, I was telling you that I was learning InDesign because lots of you had told me I was stupid to design last year's book, the 2019 book, in Photoshop. I learned all about InDesign and then basically forgot it all because I didn't need to use InDesign in April. However, it's nearly the end of the year. I need to think about the design for the next book, and therefore I need to relearn InDesign. So that's exactly what I'm doing. So yeah, a huge thank you to Skillshare for being the sponsor of this video, and just for being awesome. I've learned a lot using Skillshare, so I really appreciate it. And if you fancy learning on Skillshare, the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a free trial to Skillshare Premium, and if you carry on with Skillshare after that, you'll pay less than $10 a month for access to all the classes. And if you're curious about any creative pursuit, I'd really recommend you do that. So thank you to Skillshare, and thank you to you for watching. I'm gutted that we couldn't do this entire video out in the mountains, but that's the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. I'm off to watch grass grow.